Okay, good day, folks. Thanks for coming to Finding Warmth of Our Sun. I'm Matthew Brown, your host here at Madison 365. You can find us on YouTube, Spotify, Stitcher, Apple Podcasts, all that jazz. Thanks for coming this week. I'm going to be doing a double dip into the some of the new voting stuff, and a quote from really black scholar and historian Jamelle Bouie wrote in the New York Times about not just specifically the new Georgia laws, Georgia voting laws, but really about some of the backlash against the backlash. There are folks, particularly some conservative pundits, that were saying, well, it's not Jim Crow because it doesn't explicitly target black people, and he wrote on how Jim Crow, that's what it was. It wasn't explicit laws per se outside of some of the laws around segregation, but particularly when it came to voting laws, it was stuff like counting the beans and stuff that's disproportionately applied or specifically targeted, and that's what some of this stuff is. And one of the other things was there's another author, Nate Cohen from the New York Times, and there's a little bit in response to that. It was a bit of an argument on how this isn't new Jim Crow for this, that, and the third. I'll get in a second. And then ended with the quote, "The thing about Jim Crow is that it wasn't Jim Crow until one day it was." And that's the crux of it. So Nate Cohen wrote this article, and it sent Black Twitter into a little bit of a firestorm, and more specifically, those like Bouie and Black writers and historians, because of how much the piece focused on perceived impact or possible impact versus intent, and their wider issues of voter disenfranchisement and anti-democratic forces coming from the GOP. It also boiled it down into a partisan position instead of just, right and wrong. There are some who would choose to listen to the Nate Cohens of the world about voter suppression more than a Jamelle Bouie. So again, this guy knows what he's talking about when it comes with Black history, and particularly that of Jim Crow. He's a very, very smart man. And that focus on the impact or perceived impact versus intent, and misses the point. It misses the larger context. Now, it's curious how many white folks who are attempting to play down the impact of this law picked up on the Nate Cohen piece, but ignored a far more extensive piece that walked through it in really depth of this law, and really 16 measures. Called What Georgia's Voting Law Really Does. It analyzes it in depth and walks through its impact and intent. And it was important. So I'll suggest to go read that. It's written by Nick Corasanti, butcher that name, and Reed Epstein. Again, it's What Georgia's Voting Law Really Does. And I'm not focusing on that today. Focusing a little bit more on Nate and the larger context of what's going on. And I think it's important here. So Nate misses, he misses a few marks. The idea of making voting easier. There are, he targets this and saying, making voting easier doesn't necessarily increase turnout. Well, it does a little bit. But we also know there needs to be massive voter turnout machines to actually increase turnout. And there's a variety of reasons why turnout doesn't increase. But the main idea of expanding access to voting is to expand access to voting. Increasing turnout or hopefully electing more Democrats are just secondary, hopeful byproducts, not the main intent. Again, this is ignoring the intent of it, ignoring where our so-called two sides are coming from, or one side just, really the main intent is to expand, democratic values, not like, Big D as a party, but to expand democracy. That is very different than one party with explicitly partisan goals and racially partisan goals to shrink democracy. That is the intent of what these voter suppression laws do. And again, it's so it's this byproduct is being hopeful that it'll increase turnout, being hopeful that there'd be more Democrats elected. But that is not the sole focus of these things. It also his article also leans on how voter ID laws don't greatly or kind of largely suppress votes, and the key word is greatly. Now that it does suppress votes is just the main argument against like some of the so-called panic of voter ID laws. It wasn't, they said, the bottom was going to fall out. It's going to be, one, I think they over exaggerate the criticism of voter ID laws, partly because there's big machine put into place to overcome voter ID laws. We know that there's an impact. All the data tells us there is an impact. So even though it isn't large, we know there's an impact. And again, we have to put it in the context that there was a lot put into combating voter suppression tactics around these IDs. And we also know, though, that there was an impact. Such as Wisconsin in 2016 election, we know more voters were disenfranchised by voter ID laws than what, Hillary Clinton lost to versus Trump, or than what Trump. So there was theoretically enough votes to swing the election the other way, particularly when we're talking about places like Georgia, where it's like 22,000 votes. That's not a lot. So if we're talking about, small percentage points, and in the larger context of voting and electorate and these states, that small margin, that small shift can have huge swings when it comes to policy and who's elected. This is very, very important. So we can't just dismiss the small impact voter ID laws have had. We have to recognize it in the larger context of our elections, the policies. This isn't like a theoretical exercise. And it seems like these white men writing these articles love this stuff as a theoretical exercise instead of looking at the real world impact that these things have. And so there's this idea that convenience doesn't matter because there isn't much turnout differential. It basically implies that the intent of the laws don't matter here, but they do, especially as they continue to accumulate levels of voter suppression with the intent to suppress the vote. Again, Jim Crow wasn't Jim Crow until it was. It also relies upon the assumption that past behavior of turnout, so that voter suppression laws, voter ID laws didn't greatly suppress turnout, and in some cases we saw there's increased turnout. Again, we have to put this in context of massive voter turnout machines being built. So this was in spite of voter ID laws and voter suppression tactics that we had these, but because of these massive machines were built to counteract it. Right? It wasn't just people deciding to go vote more. There was a lot of organizing effort into this. And so this ignores all the effort of a lot of Black and brown organizers to increase voter turnout in the face of voter suppression. But again, there's an assumption that past behavior is going to be reflective of future behavior, particularly when we inject new variances. That's, well, for lack of a better word, dumb. It's obtuse. It's short-sighted. It's not a well thought out analysis. And Cohen even concedes that long lines do impact voter turnout. Again, who are more likely to have long lines? There's going to be Black and brown voters. This is a white man's analysis to say convenience doesn't matter, while then admitting long lines impact turnout, which is a convenience, while ignoring again who those most impacted are by those long lines. This dismissal of concerns of voter suppression, again, by suggesting past behavior based upon different rules will carry over to the new rules, like the inability to hand out water, these things will be equal or will increase turnout, or to assume that it will increase turnout is supremely arrogant and ignorant. The biggest problem is that this type of thinking gives cover to the GOP and what they're doing, Nate and his ilk only give passing concern to the intent of these laws, while making their their main focus, on those that are bringing up concern and alarm of what is going on, suggesting that this concern and alarm is overblown when there are real anti-democratic forces at play here. The thinking and the intent behind these bills is what matters. The people behind the bills are what matters, not the concern from those these bills are going to be impacting the most. It ignores the larger issues and behavior, suggesting that it will be overcame, that it isn't that much of a problem, because turnout wasn't that much affected in the past. This is how Jim Crow becomes Jim Crow. So more specifically, what's some of this larger context? Well, Tucker Carlson, the voice of Fox News, potentially the leading next candidate for the GOP, is definitely angling for it, who just expressed explicitly white nationalist, white supremacist views around this idea of white genocide, white replacement theory. He said, if you change the population, you dilute the political power of the people who live there. So every time they import a new voter, I become disenfranchised as a current voter. The idea import, so bringing in brown voters, and we already the dismissal of black voters, and who is being centered here are white voters, right? White nationalism. That's what this is. It's about disregarding votes of black and brown people as illegitimate, as not real, as illegal, and not real Americans. It's the white replacement theory. It's a favorite of white supremacists, again, which are now in control of the GOP. Tucker Carlson is a favorite of white nationalists. The Mississippi election chief warns Biden may register uninformed woke college voters. This is wild stuff. And was it the National Review? And conservative pundits all around, the National Review are openly talking about the need for competency tests and to shrink to the electorate, making it harder to vote. Having, civic tests, but we know what these civic tests are. This is part of what Jim Crow was. Were these so-called, civic tests that allegedly didn't target anybody, but were made in such a way to give priority and ability to vote to those who are more than likely to vote for, at that point, Democrats, but conservatives, conservative ideology, white conservative ideology, to be specific. Again, they're spending more time criticizing. These folks are spending more time criticizing or being pedantic about the so-called left, particularly black leftists, than combating anti-democratic forces. And these tend to be white men that are doing this stuff. They're ignoring what's going on in the GOP. And it's concerning. Because this is how these views become legitimate. It's how we get to a point like Trump. We get to January 6th. The persistent downplaying of concerns as things perpetually escalate. A lot of our mainstream media does the same thing. So these men perpetually dismiss the needs and words of mostly people of color and then act surprised, blaming the left when, say, Donald Trump happens. These men think they know better. That they sit on this seat of high objective truth. The problem with these economically off white men is that the battle isn't at their gates. They aren't impacted. Again, this is a theoretical exercise to them. Black and brown folks and the things that impacting their lives aren't real to a lot of these folks. The issues they feel aren't so-called bread and butter issues. I mean, this is absolutely ridiculous and racist at its root. The success or level of impact matters far less than the matters of intent. You do not let those who speak a language that leads to genocide of marginalized people and give them cover. You do not say they need to be heard. You do not criticize those that are pushing back against these anti-democratic forces, feigning concern for it and perpetually talk. No. You don't say, yeah, they lie about the election. They invaded the Capitol, but you really shouldn't call it Jim Crow because voter ID laws don't seem to have a lot of impact. It's not what you do. I mean, it's what these folks are doing, but it's not how we move forward. It's not how we confront these forces. This laundering of GOP talking points, laundering of the big lie, giving it credibility. Because that's where this originated from. And that's what the so-called justification for these laws are, is we have to restore faith in election integrity, while completely ignoring that it was Trump and the GOP that lied, then creating a crisis of Republican voters of their faith of election integrity. There's always this need to tell Black folks what they fear, what they are experiencing, or their analysis isn't what it is. And it's almost always some well-to-do white men saying these things, oftentimes ignoring the many Black intellectuals, well more versed in the history of such things, the sociological explanations and ideas of such things, than they are. Once in a while, they'll find a dissenting Black voice to use as cover. Sometimes they'll misquote, or oftentimes or take a quote out of context from Martin Luther King or some other Black intellectual to use as cover to show that they aren't actually racist, which is a very racist thing to do. While also still ignoring all the other voices, the many more voices. Well, they find the one that they agree with, that confirms their own bias. Many times not listening to these other voices, reading or exposing themselves to these other voices unless it's written through the context of another white man. They won't explore the depths of these analyses, of these Black thinkers, writers, and historians. And I'm rereading through Where Do We Go From Here from MLK, and it's really... If you haven't read it, it's good. It's a pretty quick read. Almost done with it after picking it up again on Friday. But you'll see a lot of parallels to where we are today. And a lot of warnings that he made of where we are today. Two short passages really... in the context of today, the present moment, and the expiration of renewed forces of Jim Crow and white supremacy in this country, and particularly in seeing some so-called white liberals and moderates and folks on in the media talk about these things, really rang true. So the first passage, and it starts off in the context of white liberal hidden prejudice, or what we might call implicit bias. He says, yet in spite of latent prejudice, in spite of the hard reality that many blatant forms of injustice could not exist without the acquiescence of white liberals, the fact remains that a sound resolution of the race problem in America will rest with those white men and women who consider themselves as generous and decent human beings. That's kind of the crux of the problem. A lot of these folks that consider themselves general and decent, particularly, white liberals and moderate lefts and chunks of the Democratic Party, feel that because they are generous and decent human beings, won't, But this next one really rings true to me. They both do. Particularly in the context of America and some of, in this history is that the United States has been far more of a force for evil than good in this world. You can't honestly look at this history of this country, of what it's done to Black Americans, the genocide of indigenous Americans and how it treats brown Americans and Asian immigrants and Asian Americans, and its colonial and imperial presence abroad, and this forever war and other wars, and just support of brutal dictators. It just, so much blood is on this country's hands. And some of these white men love to try and dismiss this blood, dismiss this history by pointing to the ideals that this country has never lived up to. But you can't do that. And this passage really hits at that point. It says, "But it is not too late to return home. If America would come to herself and return to her true home, one nation, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all, she would give the democratic creed a new authentic ring, enkindling the imagination of mankind and fire the souls of men. If she fails, she will be victimized with the ultimate social psychosis that can only lead to national suicide." As you can see, King never thought this nation lived up to its ideals, but it can, and it can. This is part of it, is seeing the truth of what's going on and what we are. And we have to speak to that truth, speak to the intent and what these people are trying to will upon this nation, and reaffirm itself as a white supremacist nation. No, we have to push back against us. That is our only way through. And if we perpetually downplay what is going on, perpetually press aside, well, saying those that are concerned about what's going on are being overreactive, well, it'll be the death of this nation. So we have to have a choice here. That is our choice here. The new Jim Crow, or I should say the Jim Crow wasn't Jim Crow until it was Jim Crow. And we have to act as such. And that is it for this week. Thanks for coming to Finding the Warmth of Our Sun. I'm Matthew Brungling, your host here at Masson365. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, and Stitcher. Thanks for coming, folks. Get a vaccine if you can do that. Mask up. Things are getting a little nasty out there. But stay safe, stay healthy, and thanks for coming. Have a good one, folks. Bye.
This is 365 Media.